Are there certain characteristics shared by people as diverse as Einstein, Buddha, Jesus, Joan of Arc, Dostoevsky, and St. Paul? We've all heard the expression, "I'm spiritual but not religious." Although spirituality as such has been an ever-present phenomenon, it is clear that in the postmodern world, and especially in Western society, the concept of spirituality parted its way with religion and entered into an independent discourse. I believe it is not controversial to suggest that as time passes, an increasing number of secular people describe themselves as spiritual rather than religious. Now, in this video, I will attempt to provide a comprehensive account of spirituality, analyzing this phenomenon from the biological layer up to the sociological manifestations and what it evolved into. Before getting into the gist of what makes spirituality possible and why it became so common, we need to define its meaning. I want to offer a definition that will satisfy two criteria. First, it must be broad enough to be applicable and relatable for most people who identify as spiritual. And second, it has to be concrete enough to allow scientific and philosophical examination. Now, it is not an accident that most of the time spirituality is defined in contrast with religiosity, and thus juxtaposing the two while trying to come up with a definition seems reasonable. Researchers from the University of Minnesota tracked down 53 identical and 31 fraternal twins, who were separated as children and raised in different environments. First, they wanted to investigate if there was a genetic component to religiosity, focusing on church attendance, orthodox views, and practices of organized religion. Now, looking at twins is a reliable method for differentiating and studying the relative contribution of genetic and the environmental factors in shaping human behavior. Generally, twin studies provide reliable evidence of heritability, as identical twins share 100% of DNA. However, there is an environmental aspect that must be considered, as identical twins are also raised in the same household. To eliminate the environmental component, scientists compare identical twins to fraternal twins, who unlike identical ones share 50% of their DNA, but like identical twins are raised together and share the same environment. Thus, when identical twins exhibit a higher correlation in psychological and behavioral traits compared to fraternal twins, it points to an obvious factor of heritability. There are also rare cases of twins being raised apart in completely different environments, including different religions and nationalities. But when meeting each other accidentally or on purpose, they'd always be astounded at their similarities, even in the most practical aspects of their lives, such as how one would use the toilet. Scientists from Minnesota looked at specifically these types of twins. The calculated heritabilities with regard to religiosity were all between 41 and 52%, meaning that genes were responsible for roughly half of the variation in religiousness from one twin to the next. However, one component that was missing was a distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity, with the latter being primarily influenced by social factors. As a result, they developed a questionnaire to reveal the major differences between intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity. Now, intrinsically religious people are inward related. They keep their spiritual sense to themselves. They often feel the presence of God. They practice their religion in every aspect of their life. Basically, they live their religion and are at one with it, without any external means to justify or legitimize their spiritual yearnings. External religiosity, on the other hand, describes people who are outward related. They are high in extroversion and often go to churches and synagogues, and make new friends who are like-minded. Sometimes the impulse to demonstrate their true religiosity is so high that they are ready to suppress their beliefs to impress others. So extrinsically religious people are more missionary and charismatic types. The reason why this distinction is crucial for understanding spirituality has to do with the much anticipated result that came out from the study, namely that there was zero correlation between the two, suggesting that one is very much separate from the other. A more important aspect is that questionnaires concerning solely extrinsic religiosity didn't yield any positive results regarding the heritability of spirituality. However, and this is a big however, the trait of intrinsic religiosity proved to be a very reliable trait for measurement, as the correlation in identical twins was much higher, nearly double than that of fraternal twins, pointing to its heritability. Since these twins were raised by different parents in different neighborhoods, and sometimes even in different religions, their similarities seem to be the result of their DNA rather than their environment. Now, as you might have guessed it, the crucial distinction between the two helps us better understand the gist of spirituality, namely that it is a sort of world feeling, a yearning, an inner directive force that is in essence primitive and primal. I use the word primitive with a scientific connotation, meaning devoid of cultural and rational superstructures. Sure, spirituality can be furthered, rediscovered, hypertrophied, and even enriched, but whether it could be generated from the scratch or not is another question. Now it's time for us to arrive at what I think to be the best and most reasonable theory of spirituality, defined as self-transcendence. This theory comes from the British psychiatrist Robert Cloninger, who wanted to determine whether or not self-transcendence was a distinct psychological trait. He understood self-transcendence to have three major components. So, long story short, here's the trinity of spirituality. First, transpersonal identification. Second, self-forgetfulness. And the third, mysticism. Now let's define each and one of them, and you can check whether it applies to you or not. Next, we will proceed to its biological and cultural aspects. Have you ever had a sensation, a deep and sincere one, that you are at one and in harmony with something that isn't you? Have you ever been so in love with someone that you felt like there was no boundary between the two of you? Are you okay with the feeling that your ego, self, and your very identity can be surrendered, or for lack of a better word, be merged and unified with something outside of you? This could be things as general as nature, animals, forests, plants, biosphere, and as concrete as your field of study and endeavor, such as physics, engineering, math, painting, music, software engineering, even political activism. People high on transpersonal identification do not differentiate themselves as pure Cartesian cogitos from the things to which they commit their lives. And what's most important, and I want to stress on this as much as I can, this is not a metaphor. This is not a hyperbole to poetically describe one's devotion to something. On the contrary, you should understand it as literally as possible. These people feel no psychological barrier between them and what they love. Now imagine a little boy standing on the balcony, blowing bubbles in the air. They're popping one at a time before his eyes. However, one turns out to be persistent and floats away along with the attention of the boy, who inspired and ensouled the bubble, thus forming a dyadic unit where temporarily they are one and the same entity. He doesn't just follow the bubble with his eyes like an external observer, but at that moment he is at one with the bubble, ensouling it with hope and warmth. For the duration of the bubble's life, the blower was outside of himself, as if the little orb's survival depended on the remaining encased in attention that floated out with it. This moment of transpersonal identification leads us to the second element of spirituality, which is self-forgetfulness. You've certainly heard of the term flow state, which refers to a psychological condition in which you are so immersed in what you are doing that you lose track of time and of yourself. This is an occurrence by which people find themselves lost in their endeavors, and they are constantly surprised by how time flies without them noticing it. Accessing a flow state is becoming increasingly difficult as more electronic media and short videos reduce our attention span and ability to pursue tasks that demand prolonged concentration. However, note that the flow state is not an active concentration, but rather a passive one. You are not a hunter on a psychostimulant, but rather you are a fisher sitting in a boat in a constant flow. People who can reach the flow state predictably have less tension and anxiety, whereas highly anxious people are incapable of forgetting themselves in order to be absorbed in anything outside of their individuality. There are certain neurophysiological factors to consider here. First, entering the flow state activates the positive task network, which allows you to momentarily switch off your inner dialogue, which acts as a sort of Cartesian theater in which you're constantly rewatching your past, future, potential and imaginary conversations, imagining yourself being tough in various situations, and contemplating your experiences. When a positive task network activates, you abandon this self-referential state of being, maintained by the default mode network, responsible for generating a sense of self. Not unexpectedly, the default mode network is overactive in people with depression, anxiety disorder, and ADHD, disorders that prevent you from breaking free from the stone of Sisyphus that presses upon you every day, reminding you of your corporeal existence. It is worth noting that in depression, the usage of self-referential pronouns, specifically the I, increases significantly, indicating an inability to forget oneself in a productive endeavor. Second, the flow state is attained through transient inhibition of the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is the judging, rational, cold superego that constantly monitors your actions and moral behavior. The prefrontal cortex is a novel evolutionary upgrade that is responsible for higher executive function and abstract thinking. Now, here's how I connect the dots. First, The default mode network, an interconnected nexus of brain regions, appears to be in charge of self-contemplation and rumination rather than being invested in something else. Second, the flow state in which a person loses a sense of time and self is achieved through the relative deactivation of the default mode network. Third, people with ADHD, major depressive disorder, anxiety disorder, schizophrenia, post-traumatic stress disorder, maladaptive daydreaming disorder, childhood trauma, and other mental problems linked to increased rumination, self-referential and autobiographical thoughts exhibit hyperactive default mode network. This should paint a clear picture of what self-forgetfulness is, and why people with this ability outperform others in their undertakings, as hyperactive default mode network is associated with increased stress and an inability to access the flow state. People who score high on spirituality are the most self-forgetful, which explains the modern-day popularity of spiritual activities such as meditation and psilocybin microdosing as a kind of cognitive enhancement and productivity hacks. And the third, mysticism. Mysticism describes the phenomenon of what I would term as hyperactive perception. Individuals who score high on mysticism are fascinated by things that can't be explained by science. When encountering everyday objects, they don't just observe but see through them. They never take things at face value and always look for deeper meaning in mundane occurrences. These people perceive science as omens and think that there is a higher transcendent realm that animates the material world. Therefore, highly mystical people sincerely believe that they have either unlocked or are gifted with the ability to have a connection with something that is not tangible or perceivable with our five senses. Thus, the prevalence of closed eyes in Eastern religions, the concept of the sixth sense and of the third eye in Indian metaphysics. These are types of people who would usually have life-changing experiences after an encounter or a sense of deep connection with something that they describe as a higher power. Tenkai, the young German I met in Japan, had his first satori or enlightenment experience while weeding the monastery garden one afternoon. After that, he told me everything changed. Everything. I found out that the world was still there, even without me. That's when I realized my values were really screwed up. The most important thing isn't whether I have a girlfriend or a nice car or a house in the country. The most important thing is the way that rock looks. He pointed to a rock under an artificial waterfall in the restaurant where we were lunching. That rock, the way it glistens, that's a miracle. Now, the description might mislead you into thinking that people high on mysticism are regular anti-science neo-spiritualists or something of that sort. Actually, as we're going to see, all of those traits characterize very successful intellectuals, including conventional atheists. Cloninger, a person who came up with the Self-Transendence scale, believes that mysticism was evolutionarily selected as it promotes intuitiveness in people. Studies show that such people score high on creativity than controls. Now, Albert Einstein, and keep in mind that I'm talking about the real Einstein, not the concept of Einstein, as sometimes people's names turn into more than they actually represented, was a deeply mystical and spiritual person. Let's see what he has to say. The most beautiful and most profound religious emotion that we can experience is the sensation of the mystical. And this mysticality is the power of all true science. If there is any such concept as a God, it is a subtle spirit, not an image of a man that so many have fixed in their minds. In essence, my religion consists of humble admiration for this illimitable superior spirit that reveals itself in the slight details that we are able to perceive with our frail and feeble minds. Now, this line of reasoning doesn't aim at reconciling spirituality and rationality and showing how smart people were also mystical. It's not something that I'm interested in. Rather, the notion here is that extremely creative people with staggering intellectual abilities also possess the fruit of self-transcendence, and because of their immense brain power, it is channeled into a scientific endeavor, which yields paradigm-shifting discoveries and revolutions. Now that I have presented the Trinity of spirituality, I want to briefly stress a very important point. Namely, the self-transcendence as a psychological trait is discrete and heritable and can be reliably measured, like personality traits such as agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and others. What's most fascinating is that after Cloninger devised a questionnaire with 3 subscales, transpersonal identification, self-forgetfulness, and mysticism, studies showed that they correlate with each other and thus hang together. In other words, they cohere. If a person scores high on transpersonal identification, one can reliably predict that she or he will also score high on the other 2. This is very important in psychometrics, as it gives this theory the power of prediction. Even more impressive when factor analysis was applied to the entire TCI, the three subscales of self-transcendence were clearly separate from all other temperament and character traits. They formed their own distinctive coherence. In other words, self-transcendence is as distinct from other parts of personality as eye and hair coloration are from size. Now, this study done by Cloninger took place in shopping malls, and of course to confirm the results, the experiment cried for replication. Thus, to find out whether the self-transcendence trait actually stands out from other psychological traits and whether the three subcategories of self-transcendence cohere with each other, scientists analyzed results from 1,001 subjects who took TCI. TCI is a temperament and character inventory that measures different psychological traits, such as novelty-seeking, harm avoidance, cooperativeness, and self-transcendence. Now, participants were extremely diverse. There were people from different ethnicities, different age groups, and religious backgrounds. The analysis yielded resoundingly positive results. Cloninger's study was confirmed. Not only did self-transcendence stand out from other psychological traits, but the coherence of the mentioned three subscales was very high indeed. Specifically, the reliability coefficient was higher than 65 in all three subscales. Therefore, we can reappropriate an old formula from neuroscience. Neurons that fire together wire together. Thus, if these three traits cohere with each other to such a high degree, we should expect two things. First, the self-transcendence trait might be heritable, and the three mentioned subscales should share one root mechanism, which could partially be accessible to neuroscience. Studies on identical twins with respect to self-transcendence yielded unexpectedly game-changing results. Now, the twin studies that I mentioned before demonstrating the difference between intrinsic and extrinsic religiosity generated relevant cues for scientists to follow, namely that intrinsic religiosity was the culprit here, as extrinsic one didn't result in any overarching pattern. Now, self-transcendence devised by Cloninger involves 9 questions for transpersonal identification, 11 for self-forgetfulness, and 9 for mysticism, which is directly aimed at revealing one's innermost spiritual yearnings that are independent of organized religion. To replicate the study, the questionnaires were sent to 25,000 pairs of twins by email, of whom 3,000 replied. Applying statistical analysis to the data using a technique called multivariate modeling, they found that genes play a huge role in the self-transcendence scale. Specifically, DNA was shown to account for 48% of the variation. However, when comparing data from identical to fraternal twins, the pattern was obvious. For males, the correlations came in at 40 in monozygotic, i.e. identical twins, whereas for fraternal, i.e. dizygotic twins, it was 26, nearly half of the former. The obvious ratio that was close to 2:1 in both sexes is expected when measuring genetically mediated trait. Also, the analysis further demonstrated the coherence between mysticism, transpersonal identification, and self-forgetfulness. Now, if the shared environment was a key in determining the self-transcendence level, we would expect fraternal and identical twins to show relatively equal results. After applying multivariate statistical analysis, shared environment was shown to be insignificant in determining spirituality. Contrary to what many people might believe, children don't learn to be spiritual from their parents, teachers, priests, imams, ministers, or rabbis, nor from their culture or society. All of these influences are equally shared by identical and fraternal twins who are raised together, and yet the two types of twins are strikingly dissimilar in the extent to which they correlate for self-transcendence. In other words, William James was right. Spirituality comes from within. The kernel must be there from the start. It must be part of their genes. A study done by Martin and Eves in Australia examined the church attendance of those specific twins that were tested for self-transcendence. Now, the rationale behind the study was the assumption that church-going should be a product of environmental factors rather than genetics. Now, considering that Australians and Americans share the same gene pool, there is a striking difference in church attendance, where in Australia only 7% of the population visit church in a week. In the United States, on the other hand, church attendance is double that of Australia. Thus, scientists figured that reasons behind this difference should be environmental. This is exactly what was demonstrated by the study, namely, church attendance amongst twins was accounted for by shared environment, not genes. The correlation was almost identical for monozygotic and fraternal twins, which greatly differs from the previous tests regarding spirituality. Now, if spirituality or an intrinsic sense of self-transcendence as a psychological trait is heritable, or at least partly heritable, then we should expect two major implications. First, there should be a universal neurological mechanism through which spiritual ecstasy or a sense of self-transcendence is mediated. And second, just because spirituality along with extrinsic religiousness is so ubiquitous and has always been a major aspect of human existence, then it should have evolved through Darwinian selection. Psychedelic drugs, which are famous for their ability to generate a sense of unity with the universe, egolessness, an intensified sense of connectedness with people, and appreciation for things you'd previously consider meaningless, provide clues about the neurological mechanisms underlying spiritual sensations. Punky, who was both a physician and a theologian, designed the Good Friday experiment to explore the differences and similarities between drug-induced and spontaneous mystical experiences. He hypothesized that psilocybin would facilitate mystical experiences in religiously inclined individuals, and that such experiences would have long-term positive effects on behavior and attitudes. Turns out that a psychedelic substance can make a life-changing impact, whereby people who took it experienced drastic changes in their mentality and psychological stance towards life and living as a whole. Almost all of the members of the experimental group reported experiencing profound religious experiences, providing empirical support for the notion that psychedelic drugs can facilitate religious experiences. Generally, psychedelic substances target the serotonergic system of the brain. Now, serotonin is a neurotransmitter that in the central nervous system plays a huge role in mood regulation. Later, scientists discovered that LSD targets a specific subfamily of serotonin receptors, which causes the alteration of brain chemistry and connectivity in such a way that the network responsible for generating the sense of corporeal self, along with one's everyday material concerns and self-referentiality, is shut down. The very fact that under the influence of psilocybin, the connection and information flow between hemispheres is drastically increased is quite telling. The differentiation and hemispheric specialization have to do with a process whereby the ego is emancipated from the unconscious, from the great mother archetype of primal nature. The negation of specialization and differentiation experienced as oneness with nature and loss of ego makes sense. Jean Gebser, a philosopher and a psychoanalyst, takes older consciousness structures of magic and mythic to be egoless and selfless, where humans are at one with nature and immersed in a collective I, rather than a Cartesian cogito. Now, it turns out that a vesicular monoamine transporter that packages neurotransmitters in tiny vesicles as sort of repositories where neuroactive molecules are stored, later to be released to carry out their functions, is implicated in predisposing people to spirituality. The test done by Dean Hammer, behavioral geneticist, demonstrated that people who have inherited a C allele of the relevant gene are expected to score higher on the self-transcendence scale. Now, the C here basically describes the existence of cytosine at a very specific location in a genetic recipe of this particular protein. Now, surely self-transcendence is not mediated by one gene, such as P-color in Mendelian genetics. However, subsequent studies showed a number of other genes being associated with spirituality. The emerging pattern here proves the initial speculation of Dean Hammer, whose book I'm referencing in this video, The God Gene, namely that genes for spirituality should have been connected with brain chemistry and neurotransmitters. Neurotransmitters have one clear role in our psyche. They decide our disposition towards the things that we either process or contemplate about. This is called valence, which is ascribed by neurotransmitters released during an interaction with the world, including your own thoughts. Thus, neurotransmitters shape the meaning and emotional tone with which you perceive anything and everything. Now ask yourself a question. What is the primary difference between a person high on self-transcendence, Jesus, famous yogis, Einstein, and someone who lacks spirituality? Well, it's the way one perceives, understands, and ascribes meaning to everything. It's simply that highly spiritual people have a paradigmatically different meaning filter. The rock over there is not just a rock, it's much more than a rock. Now, in this context, it doesn't matter whether convictions of spiritual people actually map onto objective reality or not. As a matter of fact, what matters is myth-making, which unites people under a symbolic order, which is by definition possible through self-transcendence. Now, to prevent this video from being very long, I will present two major biological facets of spirituality. First, the neuroscience of spirituality has to do with differentiation. In this context, this describes a phenomenon whereby during spiritual ecstasy achieved through epileptic seizures, psychedelics, meditation, fasting, or repetitive dancing, electrical activity is directed in a specific circuit of the central nervous system, which results into a decreased electrical output to other regions of the brain. The parietal association area, namely temporoparietal junction, goes silent, which generates the sense of self and one's location in space. It's like turning all the air conditioners in the house, which would limit the flow of electricity in other appliances. This process was evidenced by a study where a professional meditator was brain scanned during the meditative process. As more and more neural activity is directed to the thalamocortical loop, less and less is available for the orientation association area. The result was a loss of the usual sense of self and space that is conveyed by the posterior parietal lobes. As a result, the Buddhist meditators' brains could no longer tell where their bodies began and the outside world ended. They lost secondary consciousness, even though primary consciousness, awareness, was normal or even heightened. Religious practices are primarily aimed at achieving this neurological state with three major technological means: prolonged fasting, repetitive dancing, and pain. All of the mentioned, fasting, repetitive dancing, and pain, are demonstrated ways with which one can generate religious ecstasy, as they make one enter into a maximal stress point. Rituals aimed at achieving what's known as an altered state of consciousness constitute a cornerstone of any social formation. The Juhoansi, a Kung-speaking group of hunter-gatherers living in Botswana and Namibia, for example, have incorporated dance and song into their spiritual life in an especially vivid fashion. After sundown, a sacred fire is lit. Female singers arrange themselves in a ring around the blaze and begin a complex rhythmic melody. Male dancers form an outer ring encircling the women and the fire. They dance for many hours, beating a trough several inches deep into the sandy ground. As dawn begins to break, the dancing and singing intensify. Some of the men enter a trance-like state. Their eyes become glassy, their breathing labored, their footwork even more emphatic. They leave their earthly bodies, entering a state of altered consciousness called Kia. During this time, it is believed they can heal others of any illness and throw themselves into a hot fire with impunity. The orientation association structure becomes deprived of new information because of the selective shutdown response to overstimulation of the arousal system. The result of this is a softening of the boundaries between self and other. This may be responsible for an altered mental state described by many religious systems in which the divisions between the self and the outside world disappear and one feels as being one with the universe or supernatural beings. This is referred to as unitary state. The fact that in most textbooks about the anthropology of religion you come across ancient tribes who demonstrably utilize repetitive dancing, prolonged fasting, and pain to achieve an altered state of consciousness doesn't mean that modern societies are any different in this regard. This is a tool of social engineering which was never forgotten. It's just the ways and means of achieving it are altered. Second, genes for spirituality have probably undergone a positive selection for two major reasons. First, serotonin and drugs acting on serotonin receptors such as ecstasy and psychedelics make people friendly and more connected with the community. This is of utmost importance as during the evolution of Homo sapiens, the sense of oneness with the tribe was a determining factor in survival. Now, the fact that one gene associated with spiritual predisposition codes oxytocin receptor is very telling because although it can be counterintuitive, as oxytocin is known as a love hormone, it actually plays a key role in generating the sense of us versus them. Yes, you heard it. Oxytocin, the famous cuddling hormone, is responsible for differentiating between people to whom you belong and ones who are against you. The spiritual ecstasy of our ancestors was of tribal and totemic nature, whereby members of a group had to feel at one with their community. When playing against strangers, oxytocin decreases cooperation, enhances envy when luck is bad, and enhances gloating when it's good. Genes that make people open or susceptible to religious indoctrination may have evolved through a selection of clans competing against one another. Other genes might alleviate anxiety by allowing people to become members of a cohesive group. This line of reasoning fits the pattern of the self-domestication hypothesis, which states that humans domesticated themselves by selecting for friendliness and selecting against antisociality. Now imagine what would happen if you didn't feel at one with the community and if you didn't feel the pressure of existing religious and spiritual symbols. Secondly, the important pattern that I see with this too is that domestication of species, be it dogs or humans, has to do with the alteration of one's neurochemistry. Namely, the levels of oxytocin and serotonin are greatly increased in domesticated animals such as dogs, foxes of Baliev, and bonobos, which makes them friendlier, less aggressive, more selfless, and altruistic. These are the primary symptoms of people who are self-transcendent. That's why most of the religious figures were also healers and helpers, which brings us to the next point. Spirituality is healthy. There are 3 lines of evidence to support this thesis. Studies show that people who are spiritual have higher life expectancy than those who are not. Spirituality, with its antidepressant and anxiolytic effects, reduces chronic stress. As a matter of fact, chronic stress is the #1 culprit in causing various diseases. Now, drawing a reference from Robert Sapolsky, I want to stress your attention on one particular point. Imagine a gazelle who recognizes a predator. His sympathetic nervous system is activated. Fight or flight response is turned on, and stress hormones rise in the bloodstream so that relevant skeletal muscle groups can be activated. She has to run for her life. Every inch of her being is directed towards survival. She experiences a maximal stress point. Mobilizing energy while sprinting for your life helps save you. Do the same thing chronically because of a stressful 30-year mortgage, and you're at risk for various metabolic problems, including adult-onset diabetes. Likewise with blood pressure. Increase it to sprint across the savannah, good thing. Increase it because of chronic psychological stress, and you've got a stress-induced hypertension. Chronically impair growth and tissue repair, and you'll pay the price. Now, this fight-or-flight response, which is a multimodal instinctual reaction that you experience during stressful situation, puts heavy load on your body. In the modern-day world, people who live stressful lives dislike their workplace and pursuits, are unhappy with their private life, and are disoriented with their existential goals, are in a constant sympathetic drive. The sympathetic division of your nervous system is an archaic modality that is responsible for arousal, speeding up your heart rate, and allocating energy resources to relevant areas of your body so that you can get out of danger. Well, the thing is, your sympathetic nervous system, being as old as she is, has no idea that you are making a PowerPoint presentation in a modern technologically advanced building or university. If you are nervous and anxious, a panic attack will ensue, as your nervous system is preparing you to flee from a lion. You need to deliver a speech, right? Well, if your organism actually knew your goal, you wouldn't all of a sudden forget everything you had to say. But on the contrary, fight or flight response would help you be more articulate and calm, but it perceives your predicament the way it did when you lived in a savanna, and that's the problem. A person who lives under constant stress and experiences a chronic rise in blood glucocorticoid levels is at a significantly higher risk of developing various physical and mental illnesses. Studies are straightforward that meditation, praying, and spiritual pursuits have demonstrably positive effects on health and longevity. One experiment regarding the effects of spirituality on health divided breast cancer patients in 2 groups, one which meditated and the control group. Results showed that meditation increased their chance of recovery, and what's most important, they experienced a rise in enzyme telomerase, which lengthens the heads of your chromosomes, which gets shorter and shorter every time your cells are replicated. The shortening of telomeres is a biological basis of aging. Turns out that chronic stress limits the enzyme telomerase, which is responsible for lengthening the heads of telomeres. Therefore, the primary modus vivendi with which you can have a healthy, long-lasting life is being less anxious and less stressed. Every single recommendation that you hear from health gurus, such as exercise, positive outlook on life, traveling, meditation, social interactions, journaling, and others, share one universal common denominator. You are relieved from yourself, from the hyperactive self-referential default mode network, from the constant anxiety of thinking about yourself and being immersed in your predicament. This sense of relief is the primary antidepressant, which is the most powerful tool to be healthy and increase longevity. No wonder why there is such an overlap between genes predisposing you to spirituality and effects of all healthy activities. Namely, that they target the aspects of your neurochemistry that has to do with mood regulation, reward, motivation, sense of joy, pain relief, attention, and executive function. All of them being mediated by primary neurotransmitters such as dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine. To shortly summarize the above said and get to the philosophy of modern-day spirituality, I will sketch major points. Spirituality, or at least predisposition to it, is at least partly heritable. Spirituality is achieved through differentiation, whereby electrical activity is redirected from the network responsible for generating a sense of self to a positive task network. This neurological process is mediated mostly by monoamines, dopamine, serotonin, and norepinephrine, and neurotransmitters that play a huge role in social and emotional regulation, such as oxytocin. Gene variants associated with spirituality are directly involved in monoamine regulation, such as vesicular monoamine transporter, which in case of being knocked out in mice results in the complete devastation of critical life functions. Spiritual ecstasy experienced by psilocybin or cultural means such as meditation, prayer, prolonged fasting, repetitive dancing, and physical pain inflicted during religious rituals share the common neurophysiology, the activation of temporoparietal junction and parietal association cortices responsible for generating the sense of self. Therefore, spirituality is first and foremost an instinct that played a huge role in survival and reproduction and has proven to be the greatest antidepressant. Studies show that placebo drugs and positive affirmation therapies can be as effective as a psychopharmacological intervention. Now, in this final section, I will look at how spirituality grew in popularity and why is it always juxtaposed with religion, or understood as a better alternative. I will look at the death of God, atheism, and how spiritual instincts are situated in modern environment. Homo sapiens is a highly social animal, with a cultural superstructure which functions as a means through which humans unite in bigger societies. Symbol as such, being an abstraction, possesses the power of uniting people who are not blood-related and thus form more advanced coalitions than mere families and blood tribes. Now, one of the key differences that scientists believe made humans so successful as opposed to Neanderthals was language and superior communication skills. Now, Neanderthals are also Homo sapiens, as they were a broader subspecies. If we look at a scientific nomenclature, humans are classified as Homo sapiens sapiens and Neanderthals as Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. Now, there are burial sites where skeletons are painted with red ochre, indicating that Neanderthals had a spiritual sense. Red ochre might have symbolized menstrual blood, which was understood to function as nourishment for a growing baby. That's why they figured menstruation stopped when females were getting pregnant. Painting a dead body with red ochre might be an attempt to reawaken the deceased in another realm. Despite having larger brains, Neanderthals most likely lacked social skills and advanced language abilities. That's why the autism hypothesis of Neanderthals is so alluring, stating that Neanderthal males were isolated and exhibited advanced spatial reasoning. Works done by Louis Binford, a founder of modern archaeology, argued that Neanderthal social life greatly differed from Homo sapiens, namely that females and males lived separately, males being more individualistic and forming groups with fewer members. They would occasionally visit female societies for mating. Now, the reason I'm emphasizing the theme of language and social skills is because it functions as a technology to channel the existing spiritual propensity into a culturally productive endeavor. Now, as we saw in the previous chapter, religiosity and church attendance, along with extrinsic religiosity, were largely driven by environment, whereas intrinsic religiosity and self-transcendence were mostly determined by genetic component. At this point, we arrive at Richard Dawkins and Memetics. Memes as cultural self-replicating units use organisms, namely their brains, as vehicles to propagate themselves, the same way genes use us as transitory protein complexes to create copies of themselves. Now, with regards to spirituality, meme gene coevolution could have taken place. Now, you have to consider that during the Upper Paleolithic era and the Neolithic period after the Enlightenment and spread of democracy, no tribe, no village, no coalition, no kingdom or civilization had or required a concept of spiritual freedom or spiritual self-exploration. Even Buddhism was incorporated into a bureaucratic system of China and Japan. Naturally, different memeplexes such as totems of tribal societies and polytheistic religions up to the Abrahamic religions snatched human brains so that the existing tendency of self-transcendence could have been channeled into a specific religious symbol. Therefore, self-forgetfulness, transpersonal identification, mysticism were all directed to a religious symbol. Now here we arrive at a critical ontological distinction between spirituality and religious spirituality. Spiritual people feel united with ideologically and symbolically free entities, such as nature or the universe or an impersonal God. Their spiritual ecstasy and experience of losing their sense of self are directed towards everything and consequently towards nothing. That's why the modern spiritual formula that God is everything is so prevalent, since God who is everything is also nothing, as there is no difference-making, no identity, no intellectual aggression, and strict socio-cultural rules associated with it. The etymology of religion and spirituality makes the difference even clearer. One comes from the Latin word spiritus, which means breath, something very primal and free from rational superstructure, and the other from Latin religare, which means obligation, pointing its cerebral nature, as it is a social norm imposed upon the newly evolved brain, which has an ability to feel the social pressure and thus socialize. Now that's why religious spirituality is paradigmatically different. And here we need a little structuralism and Derrida. So we have signs which functions as communicative mediums with which communication as such is possible. Signs bear meaning, and those meanings are decoded by you. A typical sign is made up of two elements, signifier and signified. The signifier is a sound complex, an uttered word, whereas the signified is a concept that is pointed by the signifier. Note that signifieds are not real objects in this case, but concepts in your head. When you're talking about a tree, it's not necessarily a tree that a tribesman or an extinct species of other Homo sapiens would have conceptualized. Now, human beings are primarily language-oriented, referencing Aristotle, who believes that the primary reason why humans are political animals is that they speak. Therefore, spiritual instincts inevitably enter the field of language and concept production. But here's the question. What do signifiers of spiritual sensations, God, nature, universe, soul, point to? To put it another way, what are the concepts, the signifies that anchor or hijack the spiritual signifiers? That's when religious technology, and this is a technology par excellence, comes in. The primary purpose of Dawkinsian memes is to organize and anchor signifiers around the conceptual symbols and cultural instructions, signifieds in this case. I'm confident that Dawkins went too far by suggesting that memes or cultural layer of existence is independent and forms completely abstract strata of being. In order for a meme, or memeplex if you will, to be successful, it should exploit or hijack something tangible and something biologically real. And that's where the most fruitful meme-gene interaction comes in. Consider that religious symbols that unite members of Homo sapiens in bigger groups act as magnetic field. I came up with this analogy because it has a twofold aspect to it. The magnetic field of memes not only attract and channel existing spiritual instinct, but organize them into a systematic and meaningful pattern. That's the essence of the metaphysical period of cultural existence, where signifiers are anchored by repetitive religious iconotypes so that ultimately everything comes down to the highest guiding principle. Now, Derrida, in his work Structure, Sign and Play in the Discourses of the Human Sciences, points to the absent ontological center in the metaphysical outlook of Western intellectual thought. Now that there is a multiplicity of memes and that there are no fixed meanings as fixed relationships between signifiers and signifieds are deconstructed, spirituality without religion can reemerge and strive. But note that nowadays spirituality is also sold as an ideology that is in indirect competition with religion. And this offers us a chance to look at how memes and ideologies are contingent upon human biology. Spirituality in its broadest sense in competition with organized religion mostly takes a win, because it allows more freedom, offers a sense of independence, involves less externally imposed responsibilities, and what's most important, it makes salvation easier. Modern New Spiritualism gives you scientifically supported methods of relieving stress and anxiety and feeling at one with the universe, such as different forms of meditation and specific compounds that mimic religious experience without any prior preparation. This brings me to the Nietzsche's famous phrase, God is dead, which has to do with the demolition of a very specific mimetic complex, namely an Abrahamic religion. Nietzsche meant the death of universal organizing principles that anchor the shared meaning systems. The disenchantment of the world, a concept coined by Max Weber, describes the secularization of knowledge, which took its start in the Enlightenment period. From that point, the world around us has been stripped of mystical and transcendent values. All the natural occurrences of the universe can now be explained mechanistically through scientific principles. This process, along with Protestant rationalism, was directly opposed to an inherent human faculty of mysticism and transpersonal identification. However, just because the spiritual instinct is still there, Western society cried out for a substitute. Reactions like the emergence of Sturm and Drang and re-enchantment of the world, along with more cerebral surrogates like Einstein's Spinozistic spirituality of venerating nature, are one of them. The poetic naturalism of Sean Carroll is also on the list. Turns out that we didn't evolve to view nature in a completely cold and abstract manner. Even physicists are extremely spiritual about their intellectual endeavors. So, all in all, the death of God is a breakdown of the Sloterdijkian macrosphere, which protects humans from the infinite coldness of nature. Now that the metaphysical and conceptual dome of Tefnut is no longer there, People need to find other ways of salvation, as the instinctual and inherent striving towards religious experience could have never died with the waning of organized religion, as spiritual sensations precedes religion. Now humans have to cope with the infinite and silent universe that doesn't seem to have a purpose, meaning, or an ultimate reference point of space and time. Turns out that universe is indifferent to you. Modern-day intellectuals describe our existence as merely a pale blue dot, and nothing more. Carl Sagan, speaking about our insignificance, states that all the wars, religious conflicts, and political turmoils were ultimately meaningless and futile. Now that we can observe the interior of our existence from a different vantage point and see how tiny we are against the backdrop of the vast and silent universe, it becomes meaningless to direct one's spiritual yearning to a local religious symbol, right? Well, I don't know whether Carl Sagan's formulation and philosophy behind the concept of pale blue dot would get our ancestors anywhere, but what I do believe is that painting from Anselm Kiefer, Renowned Orders of the Night, best describes the current situation with spirituality. The metaphysical roof that created a conceptual warmth is not there anymore, and now the only way to cope with a mute and symbolically free universe is to feel one with it. Hence the prevalence of Alan Watts-type reasoning where God is existence itself. Therefore, the fundamental yearning for salvation never ceased to exist. However, the provider of salvation definitely changed. What are people of the modern world left with but to feel at one with the universe? It's not really a choice, is it? There are not many options if you think about it. For the closing of the video, I want to speak about how modern-day gatherings, hallucinogen compounds, and atheism are situated in this line of reasoning. First, I want to reference Aldous Huxley's Brave New World. In this dystopian world, society is governed by technocracy, controlling every aspect of being, from reproduction to education and spirituality. There is a drug called soma, which is used as a substitute for religious experience. Basically, its function was to artificially satisfy spiritual instincts. However, the reason why I find Huxley's decision to incorporate soma in his book is that it presupposes the inherent nature of spiritual sense. Huxley recognizes that even though the dystopian hyper-technological society is completely and utterly different from the traditional one, people still retain something inherent that comes from within and needs to be addressed one way or another. However, here's where Richard Dawkins is right. Memes are not inherited like genes. There is no gene for Christianity or Islam, but there are genes that predispose you towards spirituality, and there are memes that are ready to use the brain as a vessel so that your hunger can be satisfied. Think of it as competing food services. You have the innate feeling of hunger, and there are products which are competing with each other to provide what you need. Well, now the part where disagreement ensues has to do with deciding what's McDonald's and what's the healthy alternative. Now note that me using Dawkins as a reference and Memetics as an explanatory medium doesn't in any way show my personal disposition. I don't try to view this negatively just because I reference Dawkins. It's just I find this terminology to be very useful in explaining cultural tendencies. Now back to soma. Homo sapiens is a species which are essentially prone to gatherings. Gatherings are the primary way that they are able to leave their bodies and the sense of individuality and dissolve into a collective self. Thus, the modern-day gatherings of concerts, fighting exhibitions, stadiums, and nightclubs replicate the old pre-civilizational rituals. They are more abstract and paradigmatically different in the sociological context, but not in the sociobiological context, as those activities still exploit the same neurophysiological mechanisms that functioned in our ancestors. Thus, I want to offer a different definition of atheism. Currently, the operational understanding of atheism is epistemological, which makes sense because it was born out of the analytic philosophy and Enlightenment, where matters of metaphysics were discussed in the context of epistemology. Thus, atheism is defined as a lack of belief in God or supernatural entity, or a rejection of it. Now, this definition is purely and utterly culturally constrained because evidently this fixed meaning has to do with debates, where what matters is pedantry and epistemic soundness, rather than a psychobiological state of being. Thus, you can be a person who, on the one hand, regularly takes psilocybin drugs, attends social gatherings, goes to nightclubs, experiences unity with nature, and on the other hand, debates against the existence of God and describes him or her as an atheist. Now, I want to present a psychobiological definition of atheism, not an epistemological one. It doesn't really make much difference to me that someone's spiritual instincts are satisfied by chemical compounds and nightclubs rather than with a specific organized religion which just became inconvenient, politicized and corrupted, and thus less desirable. The psychological definition of atheism, which I take very personally, is religious non-musicality, a concept coined by German sociologist Max Weber. Religious non-musicality describes the lack of that sixth sense and an inability to enter an altered state of consciousness, a lack of ability to be impressed by charismatic leaders, which I definitely didn't observe in atheists who listened to Christopher Hitchens, who by the way was and is still my favorite priest. Remember the part about self-forgetfulness, transpersonal identification, and mysticism? Well, just take a look at this.
If you want to be awe-inspired, ladies and gentlemen, and let me just tell you that those of us who do not believe we are divinely created, let alone divinely supervised, are not immune to the idea of awe and beauty and the transcendent. Let me invite you to look for a moment at the pictures taken by the Hubble telescope. The extraordinary revelations of swirling, yet somehow beautiful new galaxies in color and depth and majesty like nothing I think the human eye has ever seen. Or read a page of Stephen Hawking on the absolute magnificence and consistency and underlying beauty. As Einstein says, the great miracle of physics is there are no miracles. Hawking has a colleague who looked at the event horizon of the black hole. If you could travel towards a black hole, not yet possible to do, if you could, in theory, the event horizon is the point at which the black hole is pulling everything into itself. So over into the black hole goes light itself. It's so strong it can pull light back into itself. But Hawking has a colleague who says if he knew he was dying of a terminal illness, that's how he'd want to go out, is over the lip of the event horizon. That would be majesty. That would be magnificence. That would be awe-inspiring. That would be apocalyptic.
Dying in the black hole, huh? Well, if you ask me, that's the transpersonal identification par excellence. Now, a religiously non-musical person could never be excited or thrilled with his ideology and public evangelism, which I also don't see in common atheists. By the way, Christians are wrong when they think that militant atheists have meaningless lives. I honestly, with zero cynicism, envy their absolute motivation and dedication to what they are doing. You don't just assume that the prevalence of former religious extremists turning into atheist activists is just a form of awakening from a matrix. Now, I'm perfectly aware that they have read new books and adopted paradigmatically different epistemologies, but I'm discussing sociobiology here. Thus, the modus operandi of a Western person to spread the message, to evangelize the world by telling them the truth is not changing. What's changing is the facade. Before it was fundamentalist Christianity, now it is methodological or philosophical naturalism. Again, I understand that the latter can be more cerebral than the former, but I don't believe that there is a qualitative difference at the neurophysiological level. The miniature example of an evangelist fundamentalist Christian becoming an atheist, but still engaging in qualitatively the same activities, repeats the historical shift from experiencing spiritual ecstasy through an organized, politically loaded, and overarching religions to getting all of that by purchasing a hallucinogen and simulating the same neurophysiological state, but now without much commitment and dedication. Now, as I have already mentioned, the etymology of religion comes from the Latin word religare, which means to bind and obligation. This reminds me of Zizek's critique of current state of being, saying that the modern world likes coffee without caffeine, beer without alcohol, and love without conflict. Well, probably spirituality without obligation is one of them. In this video, as usual, I provided a multidisciplinary account of what I wanted to discuss. Now, I have been studying the concept of memetics and its relationship to human biology for a long time, so let me know in the comment section if you're interested in such content. Now I want to thank my Patreons who are supplying me with books and helping the channel to grow. Your support is much appreciated and imbues this effort with meaning. I'm in the process of making the Discord channel, which will be aimed at creating a community so that free intellectual engagement could be possible. I will post the link in the YouTube community once I finish making the Discord server. Thank you for your support and stay tuned.